Why, hello. I didn't see you there.
Yes, I see everyone.
The Maria,
Oh, hello. It seems like the music didn't play, so we had a bit of a weird
we're live
beginning.
right now.
The song never came up, so we're gonna have a impromptu introduction with my lamp falling down. That's wonderful. Okay, this is a bit of a interesting beginning, but welcome everyone. Here we are live without the song, so sorry about the little delay, but all the guests are on, so we have no surprises, but a few surprises about the topics. So just very briefly to reintroduce the program, welcome to Masha and the Bears. We're a monthly show where we discuss global affairs from a progressive internationalist perspective. And before we begin our discussion, I would like to remind you to like and subscribe, hit the bell, and of course, to let you know that we are also available on podcasts. Masha and the Bears will now be available on podcast through This is Revolution on Sunday evenings. So please take it with you on your stroll, on your dance in the kitchen, whatever you end up doing on Sunday. I won't judge you, but please take our podcast with you. So today we're again talking about some major stories taking place around the world that are both surprising and controversial. We're going to be going from China and its recent democracy summit that's taking place alongside with the Washington Summit for Democracy. We're going to go to Ethiopia and recount what's been happening since our last month's discussion about the war, the gains that Abiy's government has been making there and why, who is supporting him when it comes to foreign powers. And we're going to go to Guadalupe and the protests against COVID-19 vaccination restrictions and what this tells us about the relationship between France and Guadalupe and Martinique and the overarching colonial legacies of this relationship. So we're going to be discussing it today with two incredible co-hosts. We have Kuba, the deep state Kuba here. Welcome on board. He's right here with us. Kuba, hello. Can you hear us?
Pleasure as always. Yes, I can hear you even when you don't want me to.
Uh-oh. Well, that's even better, I guess, or worse. I don't know. We'll see how it goes, you know. And of course, we have the radical Pascal, the force of reason, radical thought, and all kinds of charisma. He's been published all over in the past month since you last came on our show. So we congratulate you on your successful publications, and we're very excited to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, what's going on with you, Kuba? How things?
Things are good. Yesterday I had to step into your formidable shoes and push back on our guest on that TIR. It was a great episode, and I don't mean to suggest that he was fundamentally wrong, but he was wrong on a few issues that I wanted to bring up. But yeah, everyone check out yesterday's show with Alfred McCoy, Professor Alfred McCoy.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I missed that. I was teaching late seminar. My students were presenting their papers on Global South, and actually I brought them a lot of ice cream, but nobody ate any. So it was a little bit of a sad experience with all this ice cream jars everywhere, but nobody has taken a dive in. But the papers were interesting, but that was exactly the time of your show. So it ended around 10-15 p.m. So I look forward to watching it later.
Exactly. Yeah, if only there were some way to watch it after the fact, some website which contained videos that everyone here should like and subscribe.
Well, exactly. So now that we're done with our multiple advertisings, let's dive into the awesome content for tonight. We have so much to cover, and I wanted to start with the topic of China and the recent summit for democracy and what this summit also tells us about China's views around the world, but also how it's competing with a summit that's taking place in Washington, a pro-democracy summit led by Washington here in the US. So, Jean, if we can play the first clip, please. I'm going to stop you in about 25 seconds, but let's play the first clip from China.
Always believe that democracy is diverse. There is more than one path to democracy. The best one is the one that fits you the most. Like I just said, China's whole process people's democracy covers all aspects of the democratic process in all social sectors. It's a true democracy that works, a socialist democracy that works. China's whole process people's democracy is rooted in China's history and culture.
a true democracy that works. So this is a senior official from the Chinese government who's talking about democracy in China, democracy summit, and he is defending and projecting a version of Chinese democracy to the world that's part of this white paper that just came out by the Chinese government, a very long document that's been publicized all over, that's essentially advertising and promoting China's version of democracy. And the title of this document is also quite dramatic. It's the white paper on Chinese democracy, China democracy that works. So this alludes to the idea and the critique by Chinese government that the U.S. democracy does not work. So it's a really comparative statement. It's not just about China, it's about critique of the West, and it's taking place in a really opportune moment. The Washington, establishment, the DC is holding a huge democracy summit. It's digital summit, but it's, the government of the United States has invited many participants, journalists, officials, diplomats, all kinds of individuals from all over the world, from established democracies and democracies kind of in progress or hybrid, or the ones that are struggling with their democratization process. But of course, one of the controversies was that Taiwan got invited to this gathering, and this really upset the Chinese government. They struck up, against it and made all kinds of comments about Taiwan coming to this summit. But they also pre-planned, this was really strategic, a summit of its own about democracy. They held this huge digital forum, which also brought in experts from around the world, including some experts from the West, who spoke about the merits of Chinese style democracy. So that's something that I wanted to bring up, because I think that it's the first time we see this kind of parallel summits taking place with the same name, essentially. It's all about democracy, but very different versions and visions of democracy. And when I was reading this white paper, I was really struck by the fact that some lines in this white paper were identical to some of the lines I've read in training materials that Chinese government is using in training African elites. And maybe they're using the same lines in training elites from Global South at large. I don't know if it's only exclusive to Africa. But some of these lines, specifically a line that talks about different models that China has tried, but that did not work out for China. In particular, there's this line that I'm going to read to you. Following the revolution of 1911, the Chinese people made numerous attempts to introduce Western political systems, including the parliamentary system, multi-party system, the presidential system, all of which ended in failure. That's exactly the same line that I've encountered in my analysis of documents, training documents. So there's a lot to discuss there in terms of content that they project and why they think Chinese democracy is superior. But just very briefly, the key highlights is that it mixes or combines this electoral style democracy. So they have some elections at the village level, but also intra-party elections, like electing officials from within the party by party institutions, and consultative democracy. The idea that people can be consulted, they are consulted about their grievances, their concerns to various institutions. They're called input institutions and channels, whereby one can participate by sending letters to the mayor, participating in online surveys, expressing one's opinion in various modes. That's something that the Chinese government advertises, promotes as consultative democracy. And the idea that it's been very successful in its economic kind of progress, its economic development, it's something that highlights its performance legitimacy. So all of those factors showcasing that there is a unique, a distinct path towards democracy realization that doesn't have to be Western or doesn't have to be US centric. That's the key takeaway there. So, opening it up to Kuba and Pascal, to you guys, when you hear this word kind of democracy that works in China versus Washington, how successful do you think this move is when it comes to organizing this event so closely, linked and literally preceding the Washington summit? Do you think that has some effectiveness or potential to influence public opinion globally? Or do you see both summits as somewhat kind of cynical exercises of performance as opposed to some substantive kind of discussions about actual democracy? If we think about democracy as sort of failing or, working inefficiently, we can argue similarly in both contexts. In the US and China, there are all kinds of flaws, but also some arguably effective practices. So turning it over to Kuba first, what's your first reaction to the speech by the Chinese official and this idea of a democracy summit?
So I think that a few things jumped out at me. One was the emphasis on democracy that works. And this is a very opportune time for China to challenge the US for as a leader globally. And the main thrust of what makes the Chinese critique effective is precisely the notion that Western democratic models are breaking down in serious ways. Things like the January 6th insurrection, the perennial ungovernability of the United States, issues within the European Union, Brexit, all of these developments really tarnish the Western brand of democracy, and the Western notion that these are political institutions that not only protect civil liberties, but also allow for stable, effective administration and societal progress. So they're striking while the iron is hot, and they're going straight for the throat, rather than presenting their model as something alternative, which is exactly what the United States is trying to do, counterposing a Chinese authoritarianism to Western democracy. China is contesting the very notion of democracy that's at the center of Western political legitimacy. And there's another.
Just to briefly interrupt you, because there's so many interesting points you're making, I wanted to quickly react to them before we go further. I think the first point on critique of the Western model, kind of this opportune moment, they did also come up with another paper, maybe it's part of this paper, but there was another whole report essentially critiquing the human rights records of the United States and this idea that it's really money that drives democratic processes in America, as well as the notion of majority versus minority rule, kind of that, is it really the rule of majority? And this speech has been made many times by Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry and other officials. So they're kind of, highlighting some critiques that I think, obviously legitimate critiques we talk about here as well. I mean, in various parts of, TIR, we talk about this all the time, right? So they're not, new or
and these are critiques,
right?
that Western publics have internalized themselves, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It is hard. It is difficult to disarm that Chinese attack, because it is a problem that Western audiences, even if media figures, even if official spokesmen try to deny it or paper it over, it's just been accepted as part of the public wisdom, the public perception of how the system works. There's one other thing that I wanted to quickly touch on, and then I'll hand it over to Pascal, which is the notion of pick your democratic system based on your own cultural trajectory, based on your own specific circumstances, experiment, go with what works, which echoes to me the multipolarity, the cultural relativism that Russia puts forward on when it gets criticized for human rights, rather than trying to deny the facts of the matter. The issue is presented as, we have different values, we come from a different tradition, let us do our thing. You can have your gay marriage, or you can have your transgendered critical race theory, but let us do things our way. And that is also a very effective response. And since there is anxiety on the part of many third countries, whether in Africa, whether elsewhere, whether even in Europe, about having not just the structures and the legal institutions of Western democracy brought home, but also what they perceive as the cultural baggage of liberal progressivism, which can be quite unpopular in more traditional societies.
Yeah, this Western cultural kind of fear. I mean, in Chinese context, it's often described as a virus.
Gay pride in the Donbass.
I mean, I think it's very much kind of an issue or fear that's prevalent in many contexts. In China itself, from my readings of Chinese documents about Western culture, the recent attack on Western culture, a lot of the discussions are really mirrored in fear about this kind of culture imposition. Yeah, the idea of cultural imperialism, but also liberals, but the notion that it's kind of like a virus, it's sort of infecting the core of a society. So we have to protect against this virus, and so culture comes in as an explanation, sometimes also as an excuse, as a buffer. So Pascal, what do you think about this idea of kind of cultural explanations, and how did you think about, or how did this speech of the Chinese government official appeal to you, if at all?
Well, I think that the most important thing we have to realize is that we have to look at the Chinese political official speech in the context of where China is being positioned by the Western world, and the increase in kind of some people to be trite, say the new Cold War. I'm not a big fan of that type of rhetoric, but there has been, and we are all aware of, the heightened increased tension between the United States and the West, particularly the United States and China, from the rise of the Trump administration throughout the current contemporary administration. And what has seemed to be the case is that the Biden administration, instead of actually being interested in implementing a political corrective to the Trump posture on China, is demonstrating that he's almost kind of doubling down on the tonality in terms of the rhetoric and the discourse, in trying to position the United States as kind of like still the global hegemon of record. So in the context of this reality, I think that what the Chinese political officials' discourse demonstrates is that China as a nation is a closer student of the internal turmoil of American political reality than many people will understand, and that China is very, very willing, authentically or not, in terms of whether or not they believe or a democracy. I think that what is more important is how they're willing to rhetorically use an idea which is sacrosanct within at least the ideological superstructure of American political governance, i.e., democracy, to take such a term and throw it in the face of the United States, to me, demonstrates a certain type of boldness on the part of the Chinese that I don't think we would have seen before the current turn of political kind of rupture between the United States and China. And what to pivot to play on what Kuba was saying, what is particularly fascinating about the Chinese taking that posture is that not only is it effective in terms of how it resonates in the global sphere, in the face of the reality that China recently has become the number one trading partner to not only the European Union, but it is on the ascent in terms of its role in Africa, it demonstrates the degree to which many countries in the West may perhaps be tired of dealing with Uncle Sam and all of its internal contradictions and conflicts, and be more willing, at least on the economic level, to deal with China and the Chinese and bypass any type of perhaps assumption of human rights abuses and so on and so forth. And China, being aware of that, illustrates by using this type of discourse that it wants to throw that reality in the face of the United States and saying, look at you, like you guys can't even handle an election in your country. What good is your democracy? You know, I mean, look at all of the discourse you have in your society that's causing all of this disruption. So I think
a couple of points just to kind of just to interrupt briefly to get the discussion into a couple of points that I thought you were really excellent that you made. One of them was the boldness of the Chinese government in bringing up this whole narrative, and the second one was kind of this playing or strategically taking advantage of the very idea of democracy and what this really means. And I think the third point about the attractiveness of this kind of discourse by China. So I just wanted to make a few comments about that to give it the response, to get a chance to respond to Kuba and to you, Pascal, as well. So when it comes to boldness, I think it is kind of a bold move, and it's increasingly we're seeing the Chinese diplomacy, external communications much more on the offensive as opposed to only defensive. We've seen more defensive posture in the past where they would just defend against Western criticisms. Now we're seeing actual reports coming out that critique U.S. democratic processes, that speak about it publicly, that really kind of offend and speak with confidence about the weaknesses of the Western liberal democratic system. So I think that's definitely very much, I agree with you, that's a big shift. When it comes to playing with this idea of democracy, though, I do wonder how much of it is really effective, because on the one hand, yes, they are, kind of pushing back against the supremacy of the US system, but at the same time, they're claiming that they themselves are a democracy. So in a sense, they're still using a Western benchmark to define their own political system. So it's a very kind of ambiguous language. If you read that report, it's a lot of long sentences, a lot of new terms that still use democracy at the center of it, without very clearly defining what exactly it is. And of course, some of the aspects of it, like elections, right, they're very much contested. I mean, you can elect a village official, that's like the smallest level, but you can't really elect your national level officials or provincial officials. So there are lots of, I think, kind of gaps there. And the idea of using the Western benchmark to define oneself, to me, seems like in some ways both a strength and a weakness.
I want to interject. What is fascinating about the willingness of China to appropriate terminology of democracy posits a question that I think is meritorious of being answered, is that is China, in its rhetorical posturing of claiming democracy as part of its own mantle, positioning itself to say that we are not only claiming democracy as a function of our own political statecraft, but perhaps demonstrating a willingness to position itself as the hegemonic force in the liberal democratic Western paradigm that we currently have. In other words, to say, I'll take your democracy and I'll double on that. And by the way, I'm auditioning to replace you in that regard as well. Because there's been a debate as to whether or not China has really been interested in taking up the mantle of being the hegemon of record in the wake of the United States' obvious internal kind of diminishing in terms of the. But the question becomes: is this a demonstration that, like, yeah, we'll take up the mantle and we're going to be better at it than you are?
I just want to pick up on something really quick, which is that democracy, while the United States has beaten its death rhetorically as a way of branding itself, it's not a Western notion. At this point, it's been universalized through the decolonization, the UN. You have a broad appetite for democracy as a legitimating principle for governments. And I think that China, I think that Pascal is right, by contesting a universal legitimacy with the United States, by going after democracy rather than propping up an alternate model, it really is going for the center and trying to claim a place as an overall leader that everyone can look up to. Democracy is universal. China is a democracy. Therefore, China has a kind of universal claim for leadership, especially
but how effective it is it's very contestable, right? How effective is that claim, right? I mean, if you have so many, I mean, it's very challenging, right, to kind of claim effectiveness when you have all these other human rights abuses and various issues within China.
That's another thing. You try to separate democracy from human rights as two distinct sources of legitimacy, and argue that you can have one without the other because that's the cultural particularism at work. And
well, that's what they're claiming.
It's effective, we'll see. But the United States has done so much damage to its own ability to claim legitimacy as a democratic leader that China doesn't have that high a bar to clear in order to be competitive.
So I think Jean wants to say something here. Jean, do you want to comment on this, to contribute to this debate? I know you wanted to add some comments here. Jean?
Jean.
Yeah.
Oh, there he is.
You guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add something as well. I think also we have to look at the American political system within a broader historical context, because America claims the mantle of democracy, but even when compared with other liberal democracies, America has an extremely archaic and undemocratic form of representative democracy. Like, it's a kind of case of combined uneven development. And while the United States was, relatively, let's say, advanced in terms of democratic institutions, let's say 100 years ago, compared to many other countries around the world, today, even when compared with its peers in the industrialized world, American democracy doesn't look pretty attractive to people in Europe. It doesn't look attractive to people definitely in Asia and Africa and Latin America, who've been at the boot end of American hypocrisy and imperialism. And with the rise of social media and the rise of internet, the rise of communications technology, the fundamental flaws inside American society are far more apparent to people around the world. You can see pictures of American police murdering people or human rights abuses taking place in the United Kingdom. So I think, I am skeptical about, how much people are going to take on look at China as being a new model. But I do think China, at least amongst certain sections of elites, China is seen as a potential alternative that you can at least take bits and pieces from. And there are certain aspects of what you might call the Chinese political system or the Chinese political and economic system that countries go, that looks a lot better and a lot more effective than what's going on in America, which is both undemocratic and seemingly ungovernable.
So we have to move on to Ethiopia in a minute. I just wanted to briefly respond to Jean here. I think, it's tempting to say that people tend to be kind of disillusioned with American democracy, but when you look at the actual some research on the ground, survey research, interviews, there's still this mythology of American dream that still is quite effective. People can be critical of America, but still want to come here to study, or they still want to somehow engage with the US, even if it's a critical engagement. So I find that to be very interesting. It's kind of contradictory, but the latest surveys, for instance, from Africa about the attraction of various development models, whether it's US or China, US is still first. It's still kind of prioritized. What is this model exactly? It's a very ambiguous phrase. What does it mean, a US development model versus Chinese development model? That alone is already kind of, to me, not quite clear, but the idea that the US still has so much attraction despite US limited involvement in Africa and despite all these flaws that are visible on social media, right, as you said. So I just think that despite all of that, we have to be kind of cautious about, you know, maybe assuming that people are just kind of over America. I think there's still quite a bit of enthusiasm, even if it's very contradictory and kind of weird mixed feeling about the United States. There's still an interest to engage. Maybe that's going to disappear over time, and there'll be more and more affinity for China. But feelings for China are also very conflicted. People go to China and they have mixed experiences with the education system. They have mixed experience with racialized encounters. They have mixed experience with censorship. It's a very mixed picture. So I think that's something that also I found to be interesting. There's attraction, but also critique. So I think for both of those contexts, it's a very complex thing to unpack. But I appreciate this discussion very much. I want to move into Ethiopia because it's an important issue we're discussing next. We have 3 topics today, and we're moving on to the war and conflict in Ethiopia. That's a topic that Kuba picked, and just very few points of context before we turn it over to the video and discussion with Kuba. So first of all, we do see some changes since we last spoke, right? We have some, at least media reports and claims that Abiy Ahmed's kind of role in the field, and he's been making some headway, and that the conflict maybe is turning a little bit more in favor of the ruling regime as opposed to TPLF or Tigrayan Revolutionary Forces. We also at the same time see that Ethiopian secondary schools are closed to boost the war effort. There's still this kind of sacrifice across the nation, or at least among some groups, for the war effort. And what's really particularly pertinent for our discussion today is that there's some reports coming out that we do see that some powers, in particular China, going back to China here, but also UAE, Turkey, and Russia are providing some military support to Abiy Ahmed's government in his, military plight against this revolutionary arm, TPLF. So I wanted to bring this into a deeper discussion about the role of these external powers, and in particular the importance of this technology that Kuba brought up as his topic. So perhaps we'll play the video first, Jean, that Kuba has picked out, and then we're going to turn to Jean to give us a bit of context.
The Ethiopian government says that it has recaptured 2 towns which previously had fallen to the militants from the Tigray region. The warring parties have now been fighting for a year. The conflict has cost thousands of lives and is threatening to escalate.
A Nobel Peace Prize winner at the head of an army. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed encouraged his troops to destroy Tigrayan forces. You are heroes, but you don't know that you are. The country is there because of you. You are the ones keeping Ethiopia's existence as a country. Tigrayan youth are falling like leaves. They should know that they have been defeated and surrender. This came after Ahmed called on all citizens to take up arms to fight the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. People in the capital Addis Ababa showed up in droves. For weeks, the TPLF and its allies have been battling close to the city, part of a wider offensive that's gone far beyond the Tigray region. Diplomatic efforts are in high gear. Last month, the U.S. got involved, with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on his first African mission.
We'd like to see the parties come together at the table to put in place a cessation of hostilities. We need to see humanitarian assistance flow freely now. We need to see people detained, released.
But China is also involving itself. The foreign minister flew to Ethiopia to express his support for the government. We understand the situation in Ethiopia very well. Ethiopia has the history, acumen, and capacity to solve this problem. We also want the problem to be solved there this way. Bringing the 2 sides together will be anything but easy. The war has killed thousands and displaced more than 2 million people. A state of emergency is in effect in the capital, and citizen patrols, allegedly supported by the government, roam the streets at night looking for TPLF sympathizers. Human rights organizations and the United Nations say there have been widespread abuses on both sides. Meanwhile, with passions running high in the capital, the US and several European countries have called on their citizens in Ethiopia to leave, a sign of less than total faith that peace negotiations will succeed.
Okay, so this was a very comprehensive video here with many different aspects of this conflict. So starting with kind of this, we saw Blinken and Chinese foreign minister there in the field. I wanted to turn to Kuba about this latest reports that you've shared with me and I've read as well, multiple reports that confirm that there is technology, especially drone technology, but also perhaps other technologies being provided by China. And that's interesting in the context of China's non-interference policy and kind of being sort of on the sideways of this conflict. Other than rhetoric, we're seeing military support. Is this something that's distinctive for China? How important is this? And how are other powers involved? I've read about Russia, Turkey, and UAE. How does China's effort compare here? Kuba, over to you.
So one thing that I think that is worth picking up from our previous conversations about China in Africa, we had spoken about China being this superpower that comes in, makes investments, but stays out of politics, stays out of regional affairs, avoids the kind of multilateral policy making that Western intervention. But now we're seeing that phase is coming to an end. China is stepping up a security role as well as a political role, as the president in Canada, on the Chinese continent, and it side. And we had discussed that maybe the rapid advance by the TPLF had shaken the confidence of the government's backers, Ahmed Abi's backers, that they had picked the correct side in this conflict, since Ethiopia is a strategic key country in the Horn of Africa, water resources, large population, economic footprint, all of that. And it appears that the foreign powers, specifically the ones you mentioned, Turkey, China, and the UAE, have all decided to double down on Ahmed Abi. There have been pictures and documentation proving that drones from the UAE, Turkey, and drones purchased from China are in active duty for the Ethiopian government and playing a decisive role in breaking the TPLF advance. The levée en masse and the kind of general conscription, the national mobilization, has played a significant role in solidifying Ahmed Abi's position. But I think that is less a military move and more a means of shoring up his domestic local authority so that he doesn't get deposed by the military or deposed by another ambitious leader cutting a deal with the TPLF, but by implicating the population at large in this, what he terms as a national struggle against the TPLF, he can bolster his own legitimacy and turn it into a people's war rather than a conflict between political factions.
Just to very briefly follow up on the drone part, as someone who doesn't study or is not as well versed in military technology, and I know that you are very much involved in these discussions or worked in this field, how important are drones or drone technology for winning this war in Ethiopia, given the terrain of Ethiopia and the kind of conflict we're seeing? How important is it to have this technology for this war to be more, I guess, successful, lenient towards Abi's side?
So drones are extraordinarily useful and versatile, especially under conditions where you have air superiority. The TPLF doesn't have significant anti-air ground weaponry or a drone or air force of its own. There are ways for infantry-based forces to mitigate their vulnerability to drone strikes. We've seen that happen in Afghanistan. We've seen that happen in Yemen, elsewhere, Libya. However, it's a matter of learning. It took the Taliban, it took the Houthis, it took Libyan forces time to learn what the tactics were that prevented them from being targeted by drones. The TPLF, they're being led by veterans of previous Ethiopian conflicts, which were waged in conventional style by disciplined units, large-scale combined arms infantry battles. And those types of tactics are extraordinarily effective unless there's air superiority that can target those concentrations. And Ethiopia has good rugged terrain to hide in, but that good rugged terrain also makes movement of mass forces challenging. And the TPLF will have to adapt, get off of the roads, hide in cover, hide in hills, blend in with the civilian population, if it is to be able to withstand the drone strikes. And frankly, that's all Abiy Ahmed needs, because with his levée en masse, he has enough infantry forces that once the drones cover a region and areas are retaken, you put those boots on the ground, pardon the expression, into the occupied territory and do those exact types of operations that were shown in the video, searching for sympathizers, gathering intelligence from locals, identifying people who are parts of the TPLF, but clandestinely, eliminating informants. So until and unless the TPLF can develop an anti-drone strategy, then the momentum will be in Abiy Ahmed's favor.
So this is a really fascinating, I think, detailed discussion that we don't often hear about in the media, because it's not everybody is as well versed in this kind of technology and the context of Horn of Africa as Cuba is. So it's really wonderful. I wanted to just briefly comment on this kind of shift in China's policy, where we actually saw Chinese government is very close to TPLF in the past, when TPLF wasn't ruling power in control of the regime. I was doing research in Ethiopia at the time, and these officials were very, very closely connected to Chinese Communist Party, doing trainings, visits, all kinds of diplomatic exercises. And now we have, the shift of Chinese support for Abiy Ahmed, not so much a shift, but kind of strategic, reality check, where they're supporting their intensification. So this really just shows also the flexibility of the Chinese government and its foreign policy when it comes to dealing with this really important partner, strategic partner in Africa, not only strategically in terms of security, but also economically. It's one of its key partners on the continent. So I wanted to turn to Pascal next, because Pascal, you were the one who brought up the story a month ago. You had very interesting comments about Egypt, the conflict over water, dam, water supplies. How do you see this conflict evolving, after hearing what we just talked about with Cuba? How do you see it shifting in the past month?
Well, I think that what becomes fascinating is the involvement of not only of China, but now we're talking about Russia and Turkey. And we've been demonstrating, and those who are watching what's going on in Africa, the involvement of China has been consistent over 20, 25 years in Africa. That's not surprising to anyone. But Russia, over the last 5 years, particularly in Sudan, particularly in the Horn of Africa and the East Coast, has been increasing its participation and its role on the African continent, as well as Turkey as well. And what is particularly disturbing for me in this regard is that I'm worried about this giving a pretext to the United States increasing its military footprint on the continent. As we already know, the AFRICOM development has been, which has started under George W. Bush and was exacerbated under Barack Obama, has been a persistent militarization of the African continent on the behalf of the United States. I generally make the argument that the major rationale behind the AFRICOM paradigm in Africa is to be a kind of military bulwark against other U.S. competitors being involved in Africa economically, particularly China. I think that's one of the primary motivations. And when I see China providing drone air support to Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian government, as well as the Russians and the Turks, also being concerned with their economic and strategic and geostrategic interests, realizing that Ethiopia is not only important because of its position on the Horn, its position in terms of relative to the Nile River and its ability to control the flow of water into Egypt. It's a very important strategic location. My main concern is the capacity of the United States to increase its aggressive posture towards the Abiy Ahmed administration and perhaps side with the TPLF, and not necessarily turn this into a proxy war, but into a more aggressive dispute as being a kind of proxy location for conflict between greater powers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how that's going to play out also with the conflicts happening in Ukraine and the Russia conflict that's been taking up so much attention, I think, in the discussions of the U.S. foreign policy, and Taiwan, of course, is another area where there's this, again, proxy conflict at a very high risk. So I think from my perspective, I see it maybe as a bit of a lesser priority than those two, Taiwan and Russia, Ukraine. But of course, there's always that risk of over militarization, and the defense budget, of course, discussions are increasing our budgets even more. So there's more and more money flowing into this types of issues. So Kuba, you have your hand up, yeah.
Yes. So geostrategically, the control over Ethiopia, or a positive partnership with an Ethiopian government, would allow external powers like Russia and China to have strategic depth facing Djibouti, which is where American bases are concentrated and American drone operations are carried out in Yemen and in the Horn of Africa region. Also, the Red Sea and the Bab el Sharm Strait. I'm certain I got that name wrong. Everyone knows the Strait of Hormuz, but Bab el Mandeb Strait are strategic choke points where you can use land power or land-based missiles to block sea power, movement of crude oil, movement of strategic materials, movement of forces from Europe or by American forces into the Pacific Ocean. So I think that's where the risk to the United States is. And I think that the United States, frankly, has been caught napping on this and is reverting to a kind of 1990s, let's do a Dayton Accord, let's be a peace broker role, failing to take into account that its position has deteriorated to the point where especially a coalition of the UAE, China, Russia, Turkey could deliver a fait accompli for the Abiy Ahmed government, where the United States is frozen out because of its attempt to play moderator.
So we're moving to Gene briefly because he also has some comments to make. And I did ask him to comment about Turkey because we hear so much about China. If we hear something about Russia, a bit of UAE, but Turkey is also a really active player in the region, increasingly active. So I would love to hear from Gene about this. You know, what do you think about this involvement of Turkey? What should we kind of be concerned with or reading more about? Anything you want to add to this discussion would be great.
Yeah, I would just say, Turkey has advanced its drone industry immensely in the last couple of years, since 2010. So obviously they're exporting that drone technology, which has been used very specifically to fight in highland territories in the fight against the Kurdistan Workers' Party. But I think also we have to look at Turkey's involvement as a function of its ongoing competition with Egypt. Like one thing that makes this conflict extremely dangerous is that the central government seems dedicated to moving forward with this dam project, this huge development project, which could dam the Nile River. And this is a life and death issue for the Egyptian population. We've already seen Turkey actually, interestingly enough, has dammed Syrian and Iraqi water. And this is leading to enormous ecological degradation in these countries, water shortages, the desertification of the land. If this is going to happen in Egypt, this will have a hugely destabilizing effect on the region. And I think when we look at this conflict, I see, some people on the left see the main players in this conflict as being China and the United States in this kind of great power game. But I actually see the primary movers, in my opinion, in this conflict are the regional powers who have a lot riding on what happens. And Turkey obviously is in an alliance system, which is against Egypt. And the central government, obviously, in Ethiopia is presenting an existential threat to the Egyptian economy. So I think, there's going to be a lot of regional players who are probably going to be more interested in becoming involved in this conflict than either China or the United States.
So this is a really important comment, I think, about regional powers, because it often gets overlooked in, again, broader media discussions and analyses where they do focus on this proxy war, US, China, but there are, regional players in all of these conflicts. And I think this particular conflict, this is extremely important. So I would like to have another episode specifically on regional powers, whether it's only related to Ethiopia or other conflicts around the world. How do we think about these regional powers? What are they? How do they, interact and engage with other so-called great or major powers? What is this phenomenon? Is it new? Is it something that has historical underpinnings? I'd love to have Jean lead us on a discussion next time. But I want to also shift to our last story of tonight. The time is passing too fast, but we are moving on to another really exciting and important story that was a pick by Pascal. It's about Guadalupe and the major anti-COVID sort of measures, protests that took place there against the measures taken by French government. So let's play the video that Pascal has picked and then turn to discussing this development.
On the French island of Guadalupe in the Caribbean, a general strike is now in its second week. This after weeks of tensions there over coronavirus restrictions, particularly compulsory vaccinations for healthcare workers. It is an issue the Interior Minister has been speaking about today here in Paris. Take a listen.
La situation est toujours très difficile puisque le travail des forces de l'ordre, c'est pas non plus de rajouter et de participer à cette violence, c'est de le faire dans des façons, dans une nuit très difficile, le rétablissement de l'ordre public. Ce qui est certain, c'est que le rétablissement de l'ordre public est le préalable à toute discussion, évidemment.
Well, worth saying as well that unrest does appear to be spreading now to the Caribbean island of Martinique as well. Today, there are reports that the police there faced gunfire from protesters who've also been protesting the coronavirus there.
So this is a story that we have heard a little bit about in Western media, but I think not quite enough. It wasn't really like the major top story. And I was really excited to see that Pascal has uncovered it and wants to talk us through it more. So first of all, I want, my first question is, to what extent is this a really unique or kind of distinctive situation? We've seen other, of course, frictions between Guadeloupe, Martinique, and France. This kind of long-standing frictions. Is this something that's a huge escalation in recent years? And what does it tell us about the relationship between Guadeloupe and France, and Martinique and France, and this kind of historic colonial legacies that maybe are coming out through these protests about COVID?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is actually a continuation of a certain type of distrust that the Guadeloupean and the Martinican people have around the French government, and when it comes to issues dealing with health and health administration in the country. What we have to understand is that what France did basically in the beginning of November is that it issued a mandate requirement for all healthcare workers in Guadeloupe and Martinique to be vaccinated to be able to work in their hospital areas or face suspension without pay. And this immediately caused a major pushback amongst the citizens, particularly in Guadeloupe and Martinique, starting in Guadeloupe and spreading to Martinique, and where people were actually burning things in the street. It got quite violent. And one of the things we have to understand is that we cannot separate the situation in Guadeloupe from the economic reality. As a former French colony, 1/3 of the population in Guadeloupe is living below the poverty line. And also, there's a legacy of colonialism that exists in Guadeloupe in that the descendants of French plantation owners, who are called the Beke, B-E-K-E is spelled, still have a large control over the wealth and the resources of the island, which has caused a kind of racialized inequality in terms of the quality of life of the Black majority on the country. But one of the most important reasons why there's this persistent distrust on the part of the Guadeloupans and the Martinicans in terms of the capacity of the French to be the arbiter of health-related issues on the island is that there was a major crisis going back to the 70s up until 1993, in which France was importing a major pesticide in the banana plantations in Guadeloupe that was known by not only the World Health Organization, but all major international medical institutions knew was carcinogenic. And this pesticide was used profusely throughout Guadeloupe and Martinique. And what ended up happening is that it exposed 95% of the population in Guadeloupe to this carcinogenic, to the point that right now, Guadeloupe is the highest in the region for prostate cancer. The French are only beginning to acknowledge their role in this actual healthcare disaster. As a matter of fact, Macron has acknowledged that there was an error on the part of the French, but he has walked back the full acknowledgement that the actual pesticide was even a carcinogenic, and they're still waiting right now for any type of recompensation on the part of the Guadalupe.
Just to briefly interrupt you on this particular issue of this particular disaster from the 70s. I just read recently that there was a court trial that was dismissed. So there was an attempt to bring the French government to trial, but apparently it was dismissed because the statute of limitation allegedly expired. I think this is kind of a relatively recent development, but I was wondering if you think there's any hope for this kind of justice in the future, since it affected so many people. What would kind of the equitable measure look like, and will the French government ever take responsibility?
Well, this is the thing, though. This is what's particularly delicate about what's going on with Guadalupe and Martinique, which are, not exactly colonies of France anymore. I think the term that they use now is they kind of like occupied departments.
Overseas department.
Overseas department. Excuse me. Overseas department is the terminology that they use instead of colonies. But they are still considered French citizens, and the dominion and control of the affairs of the country are still in the control of France. I think that what is particularly precarious about this event is that France is about to have elections coming up soon in 2022. And Macron, who is generally a centrist, but has demonstrated his willingness to play kind of kissy face with reactionary right-wing discourse in reaction to some of the problems that they've had in France with the Muslim community, is now dealing with two kind of reactionary competitors. He has Marine Le Pen, which has been a kind of perennial competitor from what was known as Front National, but now we have this individual named Eric Zemmour, who is a very, very even more reactionary character than Marine Le Pen, who is talking about, returning to the glory days of France, the French Republic, invading France and bringing it back to its glory days. And as a consequence of the politics of France's internal electoral strategy, I think it makes the capacity of France to acknowledge this type of horrendous activity even less and less viable.
So, Kuba, what do you think about this kind of this development for this in the context of the French election? It seems like, as Pascal is saying, it's unlikely that there's going to be a real reckoning with this particular issue. And will this protesters appear to be keep it kind of exasperating and expanding, across borders now? Do you think that's going to be kind of a new development in the relations between the so-called overseas departments and the French government?
I think that this development will be crucial. It will be pivotal in the French elections because it fits into the central narratives of multiculturalism versus French identitarianism, the suspicion of entanglements abroad, and the reactionary turn that you're seeing with the significant support for Le Pen and Zemmour. I point out that as an overseas department, Martinique and Guadeloupe are both considered to be core regions of metropolitan France, and the citizens there are French citizens. They carry French passports. And in these kind of legacy colonies, Britain has some, the Dutch have some, the French have more, that were never decolonized. The way in which the local population was persuaded or pacified was through the grant of full citizenship, which allows access to not only the metropolitan, not only to France, but you get to travel like a French person. You get
European
access to all the EU.
Right?
Exactly. You don't need a visa to go to the United States. You qualify for programs that EU citizens or French citizens can benefit from. But I think that, which compared to countries which did decolonize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that's a significant life advantage for people living in Martinique and Guadeloupe. What we're seeing is that may not be enough, that the misgovernment and especially enough time has passed so that I think that there's a cleavage between the Martinique and Guadeloupans that took advantage of those connections, went abroad. Now potentially they live abroad, versus those that are more deeply rooted, more local. And the local problems trump that broader international access for those people whose lives are centered on the islands.
Yeah, something else I wanted to bring up, just to relate it to both of your points, both to you and to Pascal as well. That's something I've read from 2010. There was a vote taken in Guadalupe. I don't think it was taken in Martinique as well, but Guadalupe for sure, there was a vote about independence, full independence from France. And there was a strong vote against that, and mostly on economic reasoning. Part of it, I guess, is the passports and access to France and EU, but also just the economic funding, all kinds of, not just aid, but economic transactions, trade, everything that, and the concern was that the economy is going to collapse. So what's the use of this independence if we're not going to have economic development, and if it's going to affect our standards of living? So I'm wondering if now is a time where this might change, that the sentiments of kind of national belonging, identity are going to trump all those of economic development, or if those benefits are not enough anymore, or if we're still going to see sentiment that we want to stay with France regardless of these frictions.
I think that Macron has an opportunity to pivot.
Let's just turn to Pascal for a moment first, and then go back to Kuba.
One of the key elements of the discourse that we're seeing right now being proposed by both parties is more quote unquote autonomy for Guadalupe in the face of these controversies. How that manifests is yet to be seen, but I understand that with the current rising elections, that Macron is very, very kind of sketchy about his willingness to engage with the discourse around this quote unquote increase in autonomy on the part of Guadeloupe as a former French colony and now overseas department.
And this is where I wanted to bring the electoralism back in for Macron, because there is this reactionary turn in France, as there is in many European countries. And Macron is not a leftist by any stretch of the imagination. Previously, he said to fend off challenges from the left. And so he has the challenge of trying to prevent reactionary galvanization around either one of the far-right candidates through what could be perceived as a capitulation to, the colonials, with mobilizing the French multi-ethnic republicanism around challenging the reaction and bringing forward sort of positive stories of France in the world, France in its colonies, France for all its citizens, France for all races. And I would hate to be one of his consultants, because I have no idea how the numbers break down. I don't know what the smart play is, cynically, if you just want to win the election. And I don't think that he does either.
Yeah, lots of uncertainty and so much interesting kind of I guess dynamics playing out both in France but also in Guadeloupe and Martinique itself. So how this will play out and whether or not these protests are going to continue to unravel or if they're going to eventually quiet down. Of course, these protests are not unique. We've seen protests against COVID measures around the world. I think just last week there were major protests in Austria. There are some protests in Germany. There's a lot of pushback against this really increasingly harsh measures when it comes to vaccinations and the lack of privacy that some contend is, kind of inhumane or against human rights. So we're seeing this kind of also contestation going back to the very beginning of our show, democracy versus human rights.
Kind of anti-COVID international, right, is forming.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting. Yeah, kind of this various webs of information that are flowing. Some of it, of course, we could say, it's conspiracy theories or all sorts of, anti-vaccination information sources and stories. But at the same time, there are also emotional kind of sentiment, this emotional arc just about privacy, about government incursions, about lack of individuality and freedom to treat your kids in the way you want to, or to have space to attend public events without this vaccination card. And of course, all kinds of terrible comparisons being made to, Nazi Germany and all sorts of other, contexts.
Reductio ad Hitler.
Yeah, Hitler and I think it was actually some Americans wearing yellow stars to express their grievances about COVID measures, which was obviously unpleasant to watch or see or think about. So this idea of kind of pushback, I think it also brings us sort of back to where we started about democracy, human rights, these different visions of democracy. In China, of course, if we think about COVID, there is this zero tolerance policy, just no cases, completely no tolerance for any cases. And that also has left China in a bind when it comes to opening up its country to foreign students, to business people to politicians to visitors to tourists. It's still very, very closed. I haven't been back for like over 2 years, and I have no idea when things will reopen. And the Olympics coming up seems to be kind of primarily aiming at domestic publics now as sort of spectators as opposed to international visitors. So it's this COVID politics is playing out in very different ways around the world. But I think there's this interesting, I don't know if it's solidarity or this internationalism around resistance to these measures, and we're seeing this happening. But of course, this resistance also plays into deeper dissatisfaction. So it's not just COVID in Guadalupe, of course, as Pascal rightfully pointed out in our communication on the show. It has to do with colonial legacies and dissatisfaction with this kind of status quo, and this reluctance, resentment coming out emotionally through COVID measures. Jean, would you like to add something here?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point here. I mean, like, I agree with Kuba that there's a kind of right-wing reactionary COVID international, but I also think there are multiple axes of resistance to COVID vaccinations, and I think the case Pascal has brought up with Guadalupe is a very important one. The reason that there is suspicion in, let's say, Guadalupe vis-a-vis vaccination and mandatory vaccination has a different historical origin from, for example, the resistance that you're seeing in places like Austria, where it is a kind of like resistance to liberalism. In places like Guadalupe, or even in the United States, when we compare resistance amongst white people in the Midwest versus resistance amongst African Americans, well, African Americans have a very specific, historical experience of being literally used as experimental, experimented on with Tuskegee and things like that. Puerto Ricans have a similar history with being experimented on by medical doctors. So there are different elements of the population which have different reasons for their opposition to vaccine mandates, and some of them entirely reasonable and entirely understandable.
Excellent. That's a really, really important comment. Again, brings back to the context that Pascal brought up earlier about the pesticides and this unresolved case, essentially. No any kind of way of resolutions, in particular rooted in French politics, where resolving it or claiming responsibility would really damage electoral prospects for Macron and for some of the other candidates. So it's really fascinating thing to observe. And of course, really important corrective here about this historical context, that even though there may be a global kind of convergence, but it's still rooted in local context, historic context, that we have to be very sensitive to them. So as we're wrapping up, it's already past the hour, and we've had a really, I think, fantastic dynamic discussion here. I wanted to ask Pascal and Kuba, and I'll conclude with myself and Jean as well, if you want to add to that conversation. What stories will we be watching closely in a month to come? We're going to be meeting again in a month's time, and we might be having more frequent shows as well. We'll be talking about that and hopefully be able to gather maybe on bi-monthly basis. But what stories are you most interested in watching and our viewers should be paying attention to, other than the ones we discussed today? Maybe I'll turn to Pascal first.
For me, one of the big stories that I'm interested in right now is the increasing tension and friction between the United States and Russia around Ukraine and Russia's activities on the Ukrainian border, and how everyone's trying to get flexy and kind of tough all of a sudden in terms of the language and rhetoric. And I'm wondering, I'm really tired of using this like return to the Cold War metaphor. We've got to find a better way to like explain the dynamics between the United States and these global competitors. But there seems to be some there in terms of the tension between the two actors. I was watching a short snippet of a United States congressman on Fox News, and this guy was using the most insanely belligerent language, talking about how we should never back down from using first military strikes. The nuclear option should be on the table. It was incredible. I was literally stunned that a United States politician was outwardly making such belligerently reactionary, this insane statements in terms of hawkish positioning with the Soviet Union, as if the Soviet Union doesn't have over 150 nuclear warheads of its own. And it just demonstrated to me that this is like really this rhetoric is getting really kind of out of control here.
Yeah, it's a very important story. I was actually thinking of bringing it up today for today's show, but I did want to potentially invite a guest who studies and works on Ukraine and has been watching this conflict for many years to discuss it with us. So that's going to be definitely a topic that I'd love to come back to, maybe in a month's time when we regather to see how this conflict has evolved, or has it faded out, or unlikely, right? Maybe it has escalated. So like with Ethiopia, we're going to follow this one closely. So it's a great reminder, Pascal. Thank you so much. Kuba, what's the story that you're following?
Well, the Pascal kind of beat me to it. I'm the Russia-Ukraine, the tension between NATO and Russia and the Ukraine is one of the biggest and most significant potential crises, and it affects me personally. So everyone, please donate to my Kickstarter campaign. I'm raising money to arm a volunteer battalion to finally take back the Polish city of Lvov. Right? If Ukraine and Russia start going at it, I think that'll be a perfect moment to just swoop in and reclaim what's ours. But apart from securing the eastern borders of Greater Poland, I'm also following developments in the far north, and specifically the extent to which sea ice and pack ice gets replenished in the Arctic, the winter temperature maximums that come up, whether there's going to be an accelerated melt of glaciers, and whether or not permafrost continues to be lost. That these are all vital indicators for the health of the climate and the potential to avoid triggering cataclysmic positive feedback loops, especially with the release of methane. So I'll be looking northwards for the pack ice, as well as east for the Russians.
Very cheerful as always, Deep State Kuba. Thank you so much for this, reminder that we're going to be all burning and dying, and climate.
Well, at least Santa Claus can get a tan.
Right. At least there's some benefits. So, Jean, would you like to add your story? I see that you have something you're thinking about for the next month.
Yeah, I'm following the news in Turkey quite closely at the moment. There's currently a huge currency crisis taking place in Turkey, which is destabilizing the ruling party, which has governed for 20 years. And this is significant on a number of levels, because Turkey is now a major, or at least a major regional power with troops and interests across, both Africa and the Middle East and the Caucasus region. It also has interests in the Ukraine and places like that. But so, the implications of this crisis could have regional implications, and also, this could be a trigger for a more general economic. It could be a trigger for a more general economic crisis, around the world. So I think that's something we need to be watching out, because these flashpoints. And we spoke to Jack Rasmus about this the other day. Flashpoints such as the Turkish currency crisis could have very, very deleterious effects on the global economy.
That's another excellent story that I also hope we can bring back perhaps in a month's time to talk about Turkey. And again, regional powers. I think that came up as one of the themes from this discussion, that we do focus a lot on the big guys, the major powers, but I also think it's important, very important, to focus on the regional powers in this larger discussion that get kind of overlooked quite a bit. So we are lucky to have Jean with us, who's really has this expertly knowledge about Turkey and many other places as well in the region that can help us get this unraveled and unpacked and illuminated. So we're looking forward to that. On my end, I'm following several stories. I mean, in particular for now, mostly stories on China. I'm following the story about Peng Shuai, the tennis player that has disappeared or has been disappeared as a result of her allegations about sexual harassment by a top Chinese official. I've been following how this debate has unfolded, and how, for the first time, one of the major organizations, the World Tennis Association, has actually canceled all its games in China. So it's been quite an unusual pushback. For the most part, international organizations and companies don't really push back in this kind of radical, I would say, way in the context of recent history. Mostly it's verbal critique, but not so much cancellations of tournaments or economic gains, right? So we'll see if anybody else follows through. I'm a little bit skeptical of that. With Olympics coming up, we don't see major cancellations, except the US has already canceled its appearance, although diplomatic appearance, not the athletes. And of course, China has responded back. We're going back to our first theme of being offensive, that, US was not invited in the first place. So wait for your invitation before you decline. You got to be invited first, and then you can say no. So again, kind of accusing US of arrogance. You haven't quite received your invitation card, but you're already saying you're not coming. So what kind of a rude guest are you? So all sorts of diplomatic, squabbles happening there, and how the Olympics will play out. I'm also very interested in observing that. Just a brief announcement. I have a shorter kind of version of my book on Chinese soft power coming out this month with Cambridge University Press. It's a book that's going to be highly accessible to a wide range of audiences, talking about Chinese soft power mechanisms from cultural institutes to the media, to education, to public diplomacy spectacles. And I'm going to announce it back again when it's completely out, but it's going to be open access, and I'm happy to share it with any viewers who don't have access to educational databases or don't know how to navigate them. If you're interested in the copy, just let me know. And again, thank you so much to Pascal, Kuba, and Jean. All three of you have been incredible tonight. So many amazing insights, very in-depth explanations, something we don't get to hear, I think, very often from other sources. Thank you to those helping us with super chats. It's really amazing. Thank you for donating and for supporting us. We hope to be more frequent. For now, it's once a month. But wishing you, in the meantime, happy Christmas, happy New Year. And we're going to see you at the very beginning of January. Thank you so much. And don't forget about our podcast now being available on Sundays. And have a good night.